Kayak and canoe camping can be so exciting and relaxing, and it's a great way to explore a river or a lake. And it often allows you to camp in areas like islands or sandbars or other places that are inaccessible by foot or vehicle. And it can be a great alternative to backpacking in the hot, humid summer months. In today's video, we're going to be discussing 4 main areas that are required to navigate through in order to pull off a successful kayak or canoe camping trip. Welcome to my channel, everybody. My name is Jason, and I've been hooked on kayak camping since 2018 when I took my very first kayaking trip on the Edisto River in South Carolina. Now that I've gotten many kayak camping trips under my belt, planning a successful trip for me becomes second nature. But for those of you who may be planning your very first kayak or canoe camping trip, it can be a little overwhelming trying to figure out how to begin and where to start. So in this video, hopefully we can shed some light on some of those things you need to think about and consider to be able to pull off the perfect kayak or canoe camping trip. I will only be covering the basics in today's video, more of an intro for beginners. I want to keep this short and sweet and right to the point so you can start planning right away. All right, let's dive in and talk about what it takes to plan the perfect kayak or canoe camping trip. All right, number 1, river selection. This is a big one because until you choose a river that you want to paddle on, you can't really do much more planning. So you got to decide what kind of water you are wanting to paddle on. Do you want a lazy float? Are you wanting to fish? Are you wanting an exciting whitewater river? And a lot of this can hinge on your capabilities or your skill level in a kayak or a canoe. All right, once you've decided the kind of river that you want to go kayaking or canoeing on, I would recommend joining a Facebook group for that area, whether it's in your home state or another state. There's usually a wealth of information on Facebook groups for kayaking and canoeing. I would also research YouTube videos for that specific river. You can learn a lot through that. And also maybe reading up on some books or magazines of rivers in the state you are researching. I've even chosen a river because I saw it while I was driving by it on the freeway. So there's a lot of different ways to figure out where you want to go. And the next thing I do before I proceed any further is determine how many days and nights do I want to spend on the water. That helps me determine how many miles I'm going to float, and then it helps me also determine where my starting and ending locations are going to be on the river. And that often will dictate what river you choose because of the length of the river. Are you going to try to through paddle an entire river, or maybe just a small popular section? Another thing that I like to do is get on Google Earth and zoom in really close to the river I'm interested in and look for maybe possible camping locations on the banks or on islands. And it'll also help me measure distance and maybe know where possible portages or dams might be on that river. I also think it's important to have a good navigational app on your phone like Gaia or AllTrails. I know there's some great kayaking and canoeing apps out there as well. I don't personally use any, but that is something to keep in mind to help you know where you're at while you're out on the water. Another thing I like to look at while planning my river trip is the flow rate and the depth of the water. Some rivers aren't navigable during the middle of the summer when it's hot and dry, unless they've had a lot of rain. So there's a website you can get on to check the gauges on these rivers to find out what the flow rate is and the depth. That way you know if it's a river worthy of planning your trip on. And finally, another thing I like to do is print off a spreadsheet of important things of note like restaurants, bathrooms, campgrounds, portages, things like that along the way that you may encounter on a river. I will laminate that and take it with me in my kayak so I have that ready to go anytime I need to know what's up ahead. Number 2, shuttles and car spots. This is a very critical piece in the planning process for your kayak or canoe camping trip, because if you're going solo like I do on a lot of mine, or going anywhere out of state that's some distance from home, you're not going to have 2 vehicles with you. So you got to figure out how are you going to drop your kayak off, or how are you going to get back to your kayak, how are you going to have a vehicle where you take out. All these questions need to be answered. So the easiest and simplest method is obviously having 2 people with 2 trucks, driving to the ending location, dropping a vehicle off there, hopping in the other vehicle with the kayaks and driving to the starting point at your put in, and floating back down to the empty vehicle, and then bringing that vehicle back to the beginning. Successful trip. However, when you're solo or going anywhere far away, like out of state, that changes everything. So over the years, I have worked with many kayaking and canoe liveries to help me shuttle back and forth, but sometimes they're not available. If it's out of season, they might be closed down, or if it's a really non-populated area and it's a river that's not used very often, there might not be an outfitter or a livery in that area. So you have to come up with plan B. So recently I actually encountered this situation where I was out in the middle of nowhere. There was not really a canoe or kayak livery or outfitter near me, so I had to figure out my own shuttle. So what I did is I drove to my put-in location where I was going to begin my trip. And this isn't for everybody, but this is what I did. And I've done this like 3 times and I've never had a problem. I unloaded my kayak and some of my gear and hid it in the weeds. I drug it off in the woods, maybe 50 or 100 yards, completely out of sight and hidden. And then I drove my vehicle to my takeout location. And I had lined up, called ahead, and gotten permission to leave my vehicle in a parking lot near a business right where my ending location was, my takeout at the end of my trip. And then I called an Uber, and I had an Uber take me back to the beginning put-in location. And I did take a lot of my expensive gear, like my backpack with my essentials in it and things that were really expensive, like cameras and drones and things like that, with me. I did not leave that in my kayak in the woods. So I know there's always a risk of someone seeing you or finding your gear in your kayak, but I've been lucky so far and it's worked for me. So I took the Uber back, he dropped me off, done. I floated back to my truck, trip was over, truck was there, a successful trip in the books. Another way that has worked for me in the past is contacting the canoe or kayak livery ahead of time before your trip and letting them know where you're wanting to start and end. Because a lot of these liveries are only going to service a short area on the river, the popular area where everybody wants to do their day floats. Not all of them have experience with these longer through paddles, multi-day trips. So you have to explain to them, where you want to start and where you want to take out. I've had a couple of them where they are in the middle of where I want to start and end. And I drive to their business, they hop in my truck, drive me to the beginning, to the put-in, drop me off and all my gear, my kayak, and I start my float. And then they drive my truck back to their business, and at their convenience, they will drop off my truck at my ending location. And then obviously they have someone help them get back to their business or their home. That way my truck is there at the end when I finish my trip. Now, I have encountered a situation where the livery was not willing to drive my vehicle to my ending location due to insurance reasons or something. So keep that in mind. Have a plan B to figure out how to get back to your vehicle if it is left at the livery. Now, when it comes to kayak and canoe camping on a lake, a lot of the things we're talking about may not pertain, especially if you're just going to be circling the lake and coming right back to where you started. However, if you are going to be going from one end of the lake to the other, you may still have to figure out a way back to your vehicle. Okay, let's wrap up this section with this one tip. Know where your takeout location's at.
I don't know what we're gonna do. How are we gonna get back, guys?
We'll go get the truck. We're gonna walk.
Oh my gosh. How did this happen?
You might think that sounds very obvious, but it is not always very obvious from the water. I have floated right by my takeout before because I did not spend enough time researching on Google Earth what the takeout looked like, or maybe what the landing was called. Sometimes takeouts are called landings. And if you're not paying attention, you can float right by it. And I did that once and had to walk 1.5 miles up the road back to my truck. Number 3, camping. This is the best part for me. Half the fun of kayak camping for me is finding that perfect campsite along the river or on an island in the river. Some rivers will have campgrounds along the way. Some will have state parks, city or county parks. Some will be in national forests and have primitive dispersed camping. So make sure you do your research and know what your camping options are. This is where I like to get on Google Earth and scan down really close to the river and find that perfect sandbar or island for camping. Now, every state has different rules on this. I'm not going to go over all the rules and regulations on this because I'm really not up to date on a lot of this. I'm from Ohio. Ohio's rules are the landowner owns to the center of the river. So this makes it very difficult. If you're not in public lands of some kind, you are trespassing when you camp. One way around this on Ohio rivers is calling ahead to landowners if you know where you may be camping for the night. But a lot of times that's not feasible. And if there's not a city, county, or state park where you're wanting to camp that night, you might be forced to camp on private property on the riverbank. Now, a lot of times this isn't really a problem because there's not really a landowner nearby. So as long as you leave no trace, leave it as it looked when you got there, it's usually not a problem. But it's definitely best to know where you're wanting to camp ahead of time so you can plan ahead, make that call, get permission ahead of time so you're camping legally. Now, in other states like South Carolina and possibly other states, I'm not up on all the rules and regulations on different states, it's often the high water mark that you're allowed to camp under. So you're not trespassing on private land as long as you're camping below the high water mark. So this opens up any kind of beach or sandbar area along the river or islands. So camping down there is definitely easier than camping in Ohio. So make sure you know the rules and regulations in the state that you are camping at before you plan your trip. Now, there have been some rivers where I've seen cabins and tree houses right on the riverbanks that you can rent ahead of time. That would always be a nice option, but you don't always know where you're going to end up. You might have really fast water one day and you need to go much further than where you think you're going to stop. So sometimes you're forced to just camp right before dark when you see a good spot. But if you're able to plan ahead and have that location figured out before you start your trip, that is the best way to do it. And finally, number 4, gear and food. This is going to be kind of just a quick overview because you could spend an hour talking about this stuff. This is not going to be a comprehensive or exhaustive list by any means. Probably the most important part of your gear is going to be your sleep system. You got to decide if you're going to take a tent or a hammock, have the proper pad, the proper quilts or sleeping bags to keep you warm, and know what the temperatures are going to be like so you know how to pack accordingly. Next on this list is going to be a PFD or life vest, personal flotation device. Always have one with you. Now, if you've seen my videos in the past, you will notice that I hardly ever wear one. Most of the rivers I'm kayaking in are pretty calm and pretty shallow. But I always have one with me up in the nose of my kayak, so if I see sketchy water, fast water, rapids, or deep water, or anything up ahead that could be threatening, I put the life vest on. Always have a water filter with you and water bottles, because you may have to filter from the river. You're not always going to have fresh drinking water available to you, but you're always in the water, so as long as you have a filter with you, you will never go thirsty. A good pair of water shoes or Crocs is important to have with you because most likely your feet are going to get wet when you're getting in and out of your kayak. Another very important piece of gear you need to have with you are dry bags. There's a good chance that everything is going to get wet at some point, whether from rain or from splash up from the river. So make sure you have some good dry bags to keep your electronics dry, your sleeping gear dry, your extra clothes dry, your food dry. All these things need to be protected with dry bags. Obviously, your food planning is going to be a very critical part of having a successful kayaking or canoeing camping trip, but that would take an hour to discuss all the different types of food to take on these kind of trips, so we'll leave that for another video. When it comes to planning what gear to take for a successful kayaking or canoeing camping trip, the list could be a mile long. So I'm just going to cover it quickly and briefly. What are some of the things that I take with me on my trip? Obviously a stove, a gas canister, extra water bottles, fire starters, extra lighters, a knife, a pan, a fork or a spork, some aluminum foil, lots of snacks. It's going to help you enjoy your trip and get through the day having good snacks with you. Obviously a paddle. I almost forgot about that one. You can't go kayaking or canoeing without a paddle. A headlamp, a battery bank for charging all those electronics. Don't forget to bring a chair, even though you're sitting in your kayak all day. It's going to be much more enjoyable around camp, around that fire, having a chair to sit in. Fishing equipment. A lot of people like to go fishing on their kayak camping trips. Bug spray. There's not usually too many bug issues on the water, but when you get to camp, that's when the mosquitoes like to attack. So don't forget your bug spray. A towel. It's nice to have something to dry off with when you've gotten wet especially if it's cold or if you're taking a bath in the river because you're on an extended trip. Sunscreen. You're out in the open water with not much tree cover overhead. You're gonna need to protect yourself from the sun. A hat can help with that as well. A rain jacket. I've been stuck in some pretty bad rainstorms on the river, so don't forget your rain jacket. And finally, a first aid kit. Another thing that goes along with gear is knowing the kind of weather you're going to be experiencing while you're out on the water. Is it going to be hot? Are the nights going to be really cold? Are you going to get rained on? So dressing for the weather and bringing the right clothes can definitely make or break a trip. All right, I want to wrap this up with just a few quick pros and cons. For me, one of the pros is how relaxing it is to float down a river. I don't like lakes. That's why I always gravitate towards rivers. I want the river to do the work for me. I'm out there to relax and enjoy myself. If you like paddling on lakes, that's fine. But for me, rivers are the way to go. Another pro to kayak and canoe camping, like I mentioned earlier, is those areas that you're able to access by boat or by kayak and canoe and not by foot or vehicle. So you get to see some pretty cool places that you wouldn't otherwise see. And for me, the final pro would be how much more enjoyable it is to kayak camp versus backpack during the heat and humidity of the summer. You're not fighting all those bugs and spider webs like you are when you're backpacking. So you will see me on the water during the summer months, and in the spring and fall, you'll see me out in the trail backpacking. Now, kayak and canoe camping does have a few cons, but many of them can be eliminated with proper planning. The first one is lining up your shuttle or your car spot. That can be difficult sometimes, especially if you're on a river that is not heavily traveled. So that's definitely one of the big drawbacks to kayak and canoe camping, is figuring out the shuttle situation. You can get wet and cold. I've been on a kayak camping trip where the temperatures were 10 degrees colder than I had expected, and I was cold the entire time. I had shorts and Crocs, and I needed socks and pants. So know your weather, know what to expect, and dress and pack appropriately. Being prepared and eliminating mistakes can make or break your trip. Kayak and canoe camping, 1, 2, 3, 4 nights or even more, is a lot different than just a day float. So always be prepared and plan ahead. And my final con is losing gear in the water. I had to learn the hard way. I've lost cameras, I've lost glasses, I've lost hats, I've lost cell phones. Buy yourself some dry bags, have them attached, secured in your kayak or canoe, because eventually something's going to happen. You're going to get water in your kayak or canoe, you're going to flip it on something and everything is going to fall out and float away if you don't have it secured in your boat. So that is a big one. Keep that in mind and be prepared. Alrighty folks, there you have it. My take on how to plan for the perfect kayak or canoe camping trip. I hope this has been helpful in giving you some confidence in the planning process. If you feel like I missed anything important or have a specific question about anything I talked about today, just drop me a comment down below. Well, thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and we'll see you again real soon on the next adventure.